Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, Robbie, today I ask, should poor people get audited more than the rich? Well, of course they shouldn't, but regrettably, that's the world we live in. In fact, the IRS audits poor families at 5 times the rate as rich ones. According to a study by Syracuse University, Americans earning less than $25,000 a year are audited at a rate 5 times higher than everyone else. So why is this happening? Well, the IRS relies heavily on an auditing strategy called correspondence audits. These are letters from the IRS asking for documentation on a specific line item on a tax return. In 2021, 85% of all audits were conducted this way. The problem is over half of those audits targeted workers so poor they had claimed an anti-poverty earned tax credit. How are the rich faring by contrast? Well, taxpayers earning between $200,000 to $1 million a year are 66% less likely to be audited as the working class and poor. And while taxation of millionaires was up slightly in 2021 as compared to the 2 previous fiscal years, the IRS only audited about a third as many millionaires as it did back in 2015. The disgusting reality is that the most audited place in America isn't Wall Street or Beverly Hills. It's a place called Humphrey County, Mississippi, a poor county and the poorest state in the Union. 1/3 of the population is below the poverty line there. More than half the county's residents claimed the earned income tax credit. The top 5 counties in terms of audits are all predominantly African American, rural, and poor. And the least audited counties, well, like Loudoun County, Virginia, which has the highest median income in the country, they're all rich. They're all predominantly white and affluent. Any reasonable person looking at this problem would likely come to the same conclusion. The IRS's resources should be focused on auditing wealthy tax cheats, not harassing poor people who barely have 2 pennies to rub together. So why aren't they? Well, according to that same Syracuse study, the reason is that investigating higher income earners requires more resources. Rich people have teams of accountants and lawyers to hide their money and exploit complicated tax loopholes. Unlike the simple correspondence audits, auditing millionaires and their complex tax returns requires more significant training and experience. So with a constrained budget, the IRS has decided to swap highly trained agents for tax examiners who, in turn, go after poorer Americans with simpler taxes. Since 2010, the number of IRS revenue agents has dropped by 41%. And as a consequence, the number of rich people audited has also dropped. And there was an additional 31% decline during the Bush and Clinton administrations. Fewer IRS employees means less face-to-face auditing necessary for complex, high-income audits. In 1981, wealthy people were audited at a rate, again, 5 times higher than even 1999. What's going on here is a systemic defunding of the IRS that's causing poor and working people to be targets, while rich people get away scot-free. So it's no surprise that the rich people in Congress, in both parties, have at various points in U.S. history pushed further defunding of the IRS. Not only does defunding the IRS concentrate audits among the poor, it also hurts the U.S. budget, as outstanding tax balances from rich people are way larger than the paltry sums recouped from audits of poor people. The U.S. Treasury loses about $163 billion each year in taxes owed by the richest Americans, the top 1%. That's enough to cancel almost all medical debt, and it's nearly enough to fund the entire Department of Housing and Urban Development. Shouldn't the rich pay their fair share? Now, given that the IRS has engaged in predatory targeting of low-income people in the past, it's completely legitimate to have concerns about what it means to increase funding to the agency, even if the goal is simply to return funding levels to the levels they were at, say, 10 years ago, when more 1%ers and fewer low-income people were getting audited. There should be a healthy discussion about how the IRS can create accountability mechanisms that require, say, a certain percentage of audits to be focused on the rich, or which mandate that additional funds be devoted to employees who exclusively target millionaires. Note that the IRS audited just about 2.2% of millionaires' tax returns last year, which represents a huge decline since 2015, when they were more highly funded. But simply defunding the IRS is likely to exacerbate the problem, leaving the IRS with fewer highly trained agents that can handle, say, Jeff Bezos' tax returns, and plenty who can come after you. Listen to Republican Representative Mike Johnson, sponsor of the legislation to defund the IRS, attempt to defend this policy.
Do you think that there is a problem in this country of wealthy individuals and companies not paying their fair share in taxes?
That has been a problem, of course, but we're not preventing that. The IRS has an important job to go after tax cheats, absolutely, and we support that. We're the law and order team. We want these things to be done properly, but what this provision would have had the effect of doing is making life harder for middle-class working families and small businesses. Full stop. That's what the nonpartisan analysis evaluated, and that's why we know that this was a top agenda item on the hearts and minds of the American people.
Well, why not?
That's why we delivered it.
So instead of just removing the funding, why not saying you can use the funding, but you can only go after individuals who make over $5 million a year?
Look, we're open to a proper analysis and proper instructions from Congress on the use of those funds, and maybe that would be a worthwhile exercise, but that is not what happened with the legislation that passed last year, and that's why we had to unfund it and repeal it effectively. We did that last night. Sadly, it was down partisan lines. I wish we'd had some Democrats who followed common sense and went along with us on it, but hopefully we'll do better with that in the days ahead.
But there is no effort to actually make this bipartisan, because even if it passes the House, it's not going to get through the Senate, and President Biden has said he's going to veto it. So if you actually want to make sure that nobody, I'm just going to make up a number now, but let's say $2 million, nobody who makes under $2 million a year is even touched by this, why not work with Senate Democrats on something that can actually become law?
We're open to bipartisan solutions if it will actually obtain the needed objective.
I appreciate that admission from Representative Johnson about the fact that rich people are getting away with being tax cheats. But if Johnson genuinely believes that rich people should pay their taxes, he should absolutely commit to a bipartisan resolution to fund audits for people earning over a certain income threshold. Republicans' failure to do so raises some questions, especially given their own financial stake in the matter. I mean, it's easy to see why wealthy Congress members on both sides of the aisle, who are on average 12 times richer than the average American, would be eager to hide behind the poor people of Humphrey, Mississippi to earn themselves a get-out-of-audit-free card. I completely respect the skepticism of folks on both the right and the left when it comes to funding the IRS. It's healthy and, frankly, really well placed. We have to ask ourselves, though, is there a better solution to this than letting wealthy elites get away with taking bailouts, giving themselves tax cuts, and writing the rules so that their financial crimes are simply less likely to be caught? And this is a tough question. I have a lot of friends on the left who are very skeptical of increasing IRS funding because they are distrustful of these government police agencies that have done so much over time to use their power to persecute people. And that's a really legitimate fear. But I think we have to be having a conversation as a bigger, broader populist community about how to make sure that doesn't happen at the same time that we don't let rich people off the hook entirely.
Yeah, as I said yesterday, I think in the long term, the only way to have a system that's fair where the rich people aren't avoiding paying taxes and then you have poor, less fortunate Americans really getting pummeled by the system is to have a system that's less complicated, that doesn't allow itself, because the more elaborate it is, the more wealthy people or powerful people who are well connected can, to make the process take a long time, can find ways to sometimes ways to cheat the process, but it's not even it's cheating some kind of moral or ethical sense, but oftentimes it's perfectly legal. Oftentimes they're doing things that are legal if you read the fine print, that you can get away, that you can delay paying certain things. And that's just a nature of the tax code gets so complicated. Every time people try to fix it, they end up making it more complicated. They say, well, here's a little fix we need, but they're just adding more tax.
Some of that's not an accident, right? Yeah. As we just talked about yesterday a little bit, I think, there are millions and millions of lobbying dollars spent toward making sure that people like these H&R Block and TurboTax and all these tax preparers have a multi-million-dollar industry of folks that are reliant on them to file their taxes, because the penalties are harsh and everyone is afraid of auditors, especially lower income people. And it's a whole predatory system. So I completely agree with you. The government knows how much you owe in taxes, and they should tell you. But I'm curious about this hypothetical. I'm not sure if this would be true or not. But if it were the case that to issue people, like send everybody the receipt of what taxes they owed in advance of, tax day, required more staffing. If that were the case and it required more funding to the IRS and more staffing, would you be open to that? And do you think others would be open to that, or do you think there's kind of like a blanket antipathy for the idea of increasing funding to the agency at all?
I certainly think if you put it to the American people that you don't have to figure out your taxes anymore, they'll just tell you how much you owe and you just pay that. I imagine that will be a popular proposal.
Look, it seems like we just came up with some bipartisan legislation here.
We'll see what Congress can do, and we'll have more Rising right after this.